How did discovering the truth about your father's death reshape your understanding of grief?
Well, it put me in a position of now having to do something that I think is so unusual, which is to grieve the same person twice in
Hmm.
one lifetime. That's not something most of any of us are accustomed to having to do. And I had such radically different perspectives for that grief and that loss. The first time was I was 10 years old, was 35, 40 years ago at this point. And I lived in a world where we didn't talk about grief. You didn't talk about loss in the way that you're encouraged to talk about it now. I didn't
Mm.
have any siblings. My mother was trying just to survive, trying to navigate being a mom and a dad and a provider and losing her spouse. And so it was just chaotic. It was very chaotic the first time. And it was no less chaotic the second time. But I had the benefit of living in a world where you could have conversations about suicide and mental illness, and you could go off to a therapist and have a deeper conversation and have support and go to groups and talk more freely. So I mean, it's shaped me in the way that it really just changed the trajectory of my life professionally, for sure,
Mm.
and and personally too. I just have a different understanding of what suicide and mental illness really are all about.
Yeah, I suppose it's an interesting thing to grieve twice, and you're also grieving sort of two types of losses, I suppose, but also in that same thing, the two different time periods, which is a massive thing. You've probably seen such a change in how we speak about this sort of thing. Um, for anyone who doesn't know your story per se, and could you just explain why it was that you sort of grieved that twice, essentially?
Yeah, so my father passed away when I was 10 years old, very suddenly. He was in very good health, he was super active, and there were no signs or signals that anything was wrong with him. He was there one day, and the next day he was gone. And the story that I was told, of course, by my mother, was that my father had died of a heart attack. And as
Mm.
a 10-year-old child who had never really experienced much, if any, grief or loss. So we had just lost a family member the year before, which was really my first experience losing anyone. And the irony is that it was a suicide.
Right.
But again, it was 1978. People weren't talking about that openly and freely. So, I was 10 years old and my mother tells me that my father had a heart attack. And I knew that my father, while a very healthy man, was also a very big smoker. And you could kind of connect those dots. So it was not a narrative that was strange to me. It was nothing that had
Mm.
to be explained. I understood it. My father's heart stopped. It was horrible. It was devastating, but it was something you could understand. And I went through the rest of my young adult and adult life all the way through until I had been married for 20 years with two children, thinking that my father had died of a heart attack when I was 10 years old. And I learned very much by accident, 35 years after he passed away, that he had actually taken his life.
Mm.
And again, there were no signs. There were no signals that things were off. My mother had no idea. Family had no idea. And it was just the most catastrophic, impossible thing that could ever have happened. And
Mm.
it just completely changed the direction of my life.
Yeah. Yeah. What you hear it so often, don't you, around suicides is there was no signs, there was no obvious symptoms or anything. And they were quite often one of the happiest people in the room, or because they're so used to sort of wearing the mask and
Mm-hmm.
almost covering it up to everyone. You said you found it accidentally. What do you mean by that?
So some people, I mean, I've had many conversations with other survivors who haven't necessarily had similar situations in that they've grieved the same person twice, but they they found out in a more dramatic way. Maybe they were the person to discover their person, or they found a note or some kind of a message In my case, it was a conversation. It was, Sam, I wish I could tell you it was more dramatic than that, but it wasn't. It was my husband and I were out having lunch and we bumped into a family member and we started just chatting. We started chatting about our kids. And in that conversation, that I know to her was very innocuous, just
Mm.
catching up, she asked if our daughters, who were teens at the time, she asked if they had had any of the same mental illness that my father had had. And I had
Right.
absolutely no idea what she was talking about. There had never been any conversation in my life about my father ever having any sort of mental illness whatsoever. I knew that my father had lived a very stressful professional life because he had his own career, he had his own job. That was your typical 9 to 5 job. But then my father also kind of double dipped. His family was very involved in real estate. My grandfather passed away before I was born. My father really took over that business. So that was
Mm.
a second full-time job and it was high, high pressure. My father's family was very difficult family. If I'm if I'm even just being kind by saying difficult, there are other things I could say. And it was incredibly stressful. So I, even as a 10-year-old child, I understood that to be true. I would never have imagined that there was any other kind of stress. And so when my
Yeah.
cousin made that comment, it's, something just doesn't hit right. But yet in that moment, I was so unprepared for it. I really didn't say anything about it. I really didn't question her because I was really more taken by surprise by it.
Mm.
So our little get together kind of came and went, and it was probably that day or the next day that I was having lunch with my mother, and we were just talking. I didn't even have the intention of asking my mother about anything specifically, and almost before I knew it, you know how sometimes something just comes out. It's in your subconscious, and it just comes out before you
Yeah.
even realize it's coming, and that was the case. I asked my mother if my father had been depressed before he died. She said yes, which is something we had never talked about. And then before I knew what was happening, the next thing out of my mouth was a question that she didn't even hesitate to answer. I asked if he had taken his life, and she said yes. And I was completely
Mm.
prepared not only to ask that question, but I was absolutely unprepared for her to give me the answer that she gave me. But she always
Yeah.
promised herself she would never lie to me.
Mm. And you said it sort of changed your trajectory. So that incident, especially the second sort of coming of it, having that conversation with your mum at that time, how did that sort of how did it influence your desire to sort of then go into this area of mental health advocacy?
It was not an overnight transformation. I can tell you that for the first handful of years, probably the first 2.5 to 3 years of finding out this new truth, which now, from where we are here today, that was over 11 years ago. But those
Right.
first several years, it was just so impossible to me. It was just surreal. It was chaotic. It was overwhelming in every way. I couldn't get my bearings. I couldn't get my mind around things. I didn't tell my children, who at the time, as I said, were teens, and I really needed to get my own bearings in some way before I spoke to them about it and before I
Mm.
talked to anyone else in kind of my extended family and friend circle. And so it, nothing changed overnight. The interesting thing that did change ultimately, the first thing that changed that really kind of brought me to this place of advocacy work was really my belief system around suicide being a selfish act, which I know then and now is still a very common belief system where people
Yeah.
feel like, well, why didn't you think of your family and why didn't you think of your friends and your children and so on and to be honest with you, that was my belief system and it was not something that was handed to me. It was not something that was taught to me. It was something that I think, having had the experience the year before my father died of losing a family member to suicide and understanding, relatively speaking, what that meant as a 9 year
Yeah.
old child, I knew that they had made the decision to take their own life. So that's all
Yeah.
I knew. But that was enough to understand it. And I think I just very quietly in my own heart believed at that point that it was a very selfish thing to do. I never spoke about it to anyone, not my parents, not anyone else in my family, but that's just what I believed privately. And it really just carried on in my heart for the rest of my adulthood and all the way through until my father's suicide came to light.
Yeah.
And that was the thing that was the first real change that kind of put me on this path, because once I realized, and that was a very overnight thing, understanding that having a mental illness is no different than having cancer, no different than having lung disease, no different than having some kind of an illness that needs to be treated that you can potentially die from if
Hmm.
it's untreated. And it wasn't until I connected those dots, which when I look at it now, it seems like, how could I possibly have not known that immediately? It seems so simple to me now, but it was not in my thought process back then. And once it was, once all of those dots kind of connected, overnight, I really felt very compelled to do something different. I've always been a content creator. I've always, written books and columns and somehow written in my professional life, and I didn't feel like it was authentic anymore. I felt like
Mm.
I needed to be doing something else to both honor my father and to honor everyone else who I know is out there in the world struggling like he was.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's such a common perception, like you say, that feeling of it's a selfish act. And you spoke there about people feeling that after it's happened, but also before it, people also try and use that as a persuasion
Hmm.
tactic. If and again, it's done out of a good place, but people might say, "Well, think of your wife, think of your
Yeah.
kids," and it's in that moment they're not being heard, they're not being understood, they're just trying to be forced out of something that they have no control over, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so you obviously have spoken about your story of grief and you speak about it openly as part of your work. What is it that you get out of it, A, personally, and B, what do others get out of it listening to it?
Well, for me, it's cathartic, number one. For me, just being able to talk about my father kind of creates this feeling of connectedness. I feel like he's more present if
Mm,
I'm saying his name, if I'm sharing a story, if I'm talking about him with my kids or with a family member or a friend who knew him. It's a deeper, different, more powerful sense of connection. So that's what I get from it. I also I also get this, I don't know if satisfaction is maybe the right word, but maybe gift, I think is a better word. The gift of knowing that perhaps my story, me being vulnerable, talking about a hard thing. Suicide is not an easy thing to talk about. Mental illness is not easy.
mm,
But when I do that in a place, whether it's a one-on-one, whether it's an interview, whether I'm speaking in front of a group, and I can see it or hear it resonate with someone, maybe someone then says, you know what, I actually am going to share something now that I've never shared before. I have that happen all the time.
yeah.
And that to me is such a privilege to be there for an experience like that for someone, because now all of a sudden my experience, what I've gone through, whatever pain or sadness or grief I've gone through, has allowed me to be in a position to share that with someone and create a pathway for them to share their experience. It opens the gates. Like, you can call it a dozen different things, but it basically just means I'm giving permission to other people who may not feel like they can talk about what's happened to them.
Yeah.
So it gives people an outlet. It gives people a sense of community. It gives people a sense of safety. And I'm grateful for that. I'm really grateful for that. That's one of the reasons why, along with being an advocate and along with speaking as often as I do, I also am on the crisis lifelines as
Right.
a suicide and crisis hotline um, hotline worker. And for me, I get to be that person that my father didn't have. I mean, they didn't have things like that. That didn't exist. And who knows, maybe if they had existed, the outcome would have been different. I don't know, but I know that by being on the lifelines in this capacity, it's not only honoring him, but it's hopefully helping someone who may not have gotten help otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's such an important thing to do. And I did it for a year as well here on the Samaritans charity
Hmm.
lifeline sort of thing. And I know for me personally, I did it because I sort of seen people at their lowest point around me, people who had family, friends, and on the outside weren't lonely, but on the inside felt awfully lonely. Um, and so thinking of people out there who maybe really are lonely externally as well and don't really leave the house or anything, to just have that person to call is such an important thing, such an important moment for them to be able to just say and get stuff out.
Yeah, yeah. And the interesting thing about these lifelines too, what we notice a lot, I wonder if you notice it when you were on the Samaritans line, is that obviously it's for people who are in crisis, who are struggling with some kind of a mental health crisis, which doesn't necessarily have to mean that they're on the verge of suicide. It could be, like you said, it could be loneliness, it could be a breakup, it could be abuse, it could be any number of different things.
Yeah.
We have a whole cohort of people on our lifeline who we call familiar voices. So I'm on the Trevor Project Lifeline here in the US, and we have people who we identify as familiar voices because those people are the people who are the lonely ones without family or community or partners or spouses. And they call the same time every day for that 10 or 15-minute connection with another human
Mm.
being. Maybe they're just telling you what they're going to do today or what they did do today. And they just need that person to person contact. So it's so valuable, and there's so many different ways that people need to be supported, and it's not just in what we would all consider to be active crisis.
Yeah. But if they were unable to sort of share that and speak out, it could definitely lead to that. So it's almost that stopping it beforehand, before it gets to that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are the sort of benefits in your mind of people being able to speak out? So whether that's verbally or whether it's some form of journaling, what what does getting something out of your mind and out out of your mind, how does that help people?
I think for the people who I've spoken to, and also myself as well, you mentioned journaling. I do that every day. It's a part of my own practice. And, I also have a therapist who I see regularly, and that's a wonderful outlet. Getting these things out, whether it's in a group, it's on paper, it's one on one, it's on a lifeline, doing that is a way to not only purge, it's like the old purging a radiator so that it doesn't blow. It's the same
Mm,
scenario with our mental health. If we don't somehow get it out of our heads, first of all, it becomes overwhelming and incredibly debilitating. It also is difficult when we have thought loops that we can't break because so often these loops that we play over and over, these narratives that we create in our heads, if we're low, if we're hurting, if we're grieving, we can't get out of them because we're the only ones processing them in our brain. We're not exchanging that information. We're not bringing anybody else into the conversation or getting other input from other people. And when we do that, whether it's, like I said, through a group or a lifeline or a friend or a peer counselor, it it just is the same endless hamster wheel in your head of thoughts that we can't break. It's very difficult to break it, but when you start articulating these things, oftentimes the things that we say out loud, we're like, oh,
yeah.
that's nuts. Why am I stressing about that? You're right. That really is, like, you get a different perspective, or even just hearing yourself say it puts it in a different perspective. So there are so many different benefits of sharing what's going on the inside in whatever way you choose to do it, because there can be sometimes the kind of validation that we need that something is a big deal, or maybe it's the reassurance that we need by sharing it that something isn't as big of a deal as we've blown it up to be in our heads. So those
Yeah.
are some of the reasons why it's just so important to just just be open and vulnerable. It's one of the best gifts I think that we can give ourselves is just to share what's on the inside.
Yeah, I totally agree. As someone who has lived through grief as many times as you have, you're a three-time survivor of suicide loss. How's living through those experiences shaped your perception of resilience? It's a word we hear a lot.
I think in my case, and obviously I can only speak for myself, there is only forward. And I've learned through an incredible amount of pain in my life over the course of my life since I, was 9 years old and experienced that first suicide loss. It teaches you in the hardest of ways that there are two choices. We all really do have two choices. We can let whatever it is that we're experiencing completely shut us down, take us down, incapacitate us, or we can allow whatever it is that we're dealing with, whatever kind of loss or grief or crisis or challenge, we can sit with it. I say this a lot. I say we need to let ourselves sit in it, and the it can be different for every one of us. It can be grief, losing a job, losing a partner, losing a pet. It can be an argument with a friend, whatever it is that you're challenged with. I
Yeah.
think the way that we build resilience is by letting ourselves sit in it and let it be what it is until it's not that thing anymore. Because this is the thing that we don't often focus on enough, I think. We get so isolated in these moments. We get that tunnel vision where whatever it is that we're feeling when it's so heightened and so intense, you don't see another side to it. You don't want
Mm.
anyone to tell you there's another side to this. You won't always feel the way you feel. But the truth is, you actually will. And by sitting in these feelings or experiences, it's it's giving us a thicker layer of resilience to be able to move forward, because at the end of the day all we can do is move forward, but
Yeah.
we get to drive the pace of how we move forward, which is
Mm.
something we also tend to forget. We don't have to grieve in the same way that other people grieve. We don't have to cycle through challenges at the same pace that others do. We reserve the right to do that on our own. And the more often we do that, the thicker our layer of resilience becomes so that we can handle it. Maybe we're a little more equipped, better equipped
Yeah.
the next time and the next time and so on, because that's life, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's always going to be something else. And the more resilient we are, the better equipped we are to handle it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I spoke to someone before, a grief educator, who spoke about treating these little things as small griefs. So obviously losing a loved one is the largest sort of level of grief you're going to find, but something is what might seem as simple as not getting a job that you really, really wanted, and you've already in your mind created this image of you with this new life and this new job, and then you don't get it, rather than sort of going to people and saying, oh, don't worry, you'll get a great job in the future, or they don't know what they're missing out on. Well, actually, no, yeah, it is a bit shit
Mm-hmm.
because you've sort of pictured yourself, and just letting yourself sit in that moment of, yeah, this is shit, but eventually we'll move on. And I like that idea of there is only forward as well. Really cool.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it combines both of the things that you and I just said, that which is the reality of any situation is that there's a where there is an up or a positive, there's also usually a down and a negative, whatever that may be. And both of those things have to be acknowledged. They always have to be acknowledged, because when they aren't acknowledged, that's when we suffer for it further down the road. It comes back. It maybe in some way it becomes unresolved. And that's why don't be afraid if you're listening to this and you know that someone's lost someone or something that's changed their life, either permanently or in the moment. Just say, I'm really sorry. This really has to suck for you. That's so, I know for myself,
Mm.
that's a different kind of validation that most people don't often lean into as much. But that's hugely valuable. If you're someone who's grieving, none of us want to see anybody we love hurt. So our inclination, the instinct is always to say the thing like, oh, they're better off. You're better off without them, or don't worry, you'll be better off down the road. Or people sometimes just want to hear that you acknowledge that it sucks.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah, for
valuable.
sure. Yeah. There's a term that I've heard you sort of mention before and talk about, radical acceptance. Could you just explain that term and what that means to you?
It's a very timely question you're asking me because less than 2 hours ago, I had this conversation with my husband about radical acceptance relating to just something in our life.
Right.
And what it really means, it most certainly is not something that I created. I give my therapist full and total credit for bringing it to me. It really, in its simplest terms, just means there is a situation, whatever that situation may be. And again, we've talked about all sorts of different scenarios: losing a job, losing a person, losing a home, losing a job. There are things that are beyond our control. We can always, almost always, control how we act or react, which is what we have in our control. But
Yep.
we can't, like, I can't control you. I can't control what you're going to say or what you're going to do, only how I react to it. So radical acceptance, when you break it all down, really just means accepting something for what it is in that moment. Like we just said, if it's a horrible, shitty, painful situation, we acknowledge it and accept it as that thing. And we let ourselves feel it as that thing. And
Mm,
then, in whatever timing suits us, then we get to say, okay, now how am I going to react? After I've taken it for what it is at face value, now how can I move forward in a way that I can affect some change, or I can maintain some control? But it really is just about accepting something for what it is without trying to change it.
yeah. Yeah. It sounds very similar to the sort of Stoic Latin phrase "amor fati," love your fate.
Mm-hmm.
That's what comes to my mind, and that's what's written on my necklace in here. So,
Yeah, oh, I love that.
um, yeah, I think it's a really good reminder to people that, yeah, you can't change what's going to happen. Accept it for what it is, and then move forward at a timely pace.
Yeah.
Um, you mentioned about your work as a crisis counselor as well. So, what are some of the most powerful lessons that you've learned from doing that work?
I think I've honed the art, honed it in terms of where I was with it before I was on the crisis lifelines to where I am now. I think I've honed my own ability to effectively hold space for people.
Mm,
I don't know about you, and I don't know about anyone else who's listening, but for me, whenever I would hold space, and if someone isn't familiar with the term, it just means listening, different way of saying
right.
listening. If I'm holding space for someone, the inclination, if they say something has happened, if they're upset about a situation, we all want to inject that, oh, that happened to me. I get it. I understand. I went through it. I know what that feels like. Or you want to give an anecdote, something to maybe help the person feel more connected to you. That's the natural inclination, or at least it was always mine. And what
Right.
I've learned is that that actually takes the conversation away from the person you're holding space from. Even if you're well intentioned, even if it's designed to give that person perspective that helps things get easier, feel easier, we're taking that conversation away from that person. And now all of a sudden it's on us. So, what I've been trained, and through my experience with Trevor Project, and I'm also a licensed 988 crisis counselor here in the US as well, it's really all about maintaining agency, maintaining that person's agency that you're trying to help. In the context of this conversation, we're talking about people who call a lifeline. But in the context of anybody who might be listening to our conversation, we're talking about the conversations you have with people who come to you who are upset or grieving or lost or scared. And what I've learned is really and truly just to let that person drive the conversation in whatever way they possibly need to drive that conversation. Like, they
Mm,
should not be distracted by anything that we have to offer. We need to hold space just whatever it is that person is sharing, we need to take it at face value. Even if it sounds outlandish, even if it's something that wouldn't faze us in the least bit, we have to acknowledge that that is the thing that is most overwhelming for them right now, and that everybody's different. And that's one of the things that I've learned over these last several years that's not just helped me on lifelines, but it's helped me with my children, it's helped me with my husband and my family and my friends. I listen in a
Yeah.
different way now, and
Mm,
I really do talk a lot less and listen a lot more.
mm. It's so interesting that what you say there about people trying to relate to someone. So you say a problem, I say I've had a similar problem. Let me tell you about it. And it's such a common thing because the person trying to help is trying to connect with them and trying to say to them, I sort of understand how you're feeling. But the other person's just hearing, you're not listening to me.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why, I said a minute ago about just the art, because it really is an art of validation and how powerful that is
Mm,
when you're having a conversation with someone who's struggling, because at the end of the day, the person wants to be heard. The person wants to be validated that what their struggle or challenge is real.
yeah.
And we don't often do that. We try to minimize. I know I certainly have, like, oh, it's not that bad, or oh, it's going to get better, or wow, you're better off without the thing or the person. But in reality, that person has every right to be sad or scared or whatever they're feeling. And all they really want to do is get permission to feel that way. And that's
Yeah.
what we often deprive them of when we try to minimize things and soften things. That's why we have to just let it be what it is.
Mm. We spoke about sort of the misconception around suicide that it's a selfish act. Are there any other common misconceptions that you've come up against in sort of suicide or mental health?
I don't know if I would put this under the misconception category, but one thing that is changing in kind of the mental health community and that has changed is the way we talk about these things.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the biggest issues that people have now, I know I have it, is when someone says committed suicide.
Right.
That's something that collectively the mental health community is really banding together to try and shift, because when you think about things like stereotypes, and obviously we all know that there is a huge stereotype with suicide and with mental illness to begin with, what perpetuates that is the way we talk about it. And classifying it as a negative act, which is really what we're doing when we say committed suicide, because you think of the word committed and you think of it in terms of a sin or a
Mm.
crime or adultery, or when you attach it to that word, you're predisposing it to be a negative right from the
Yeah.
start. So in that way, that's something that needs to change, needs to continue to change. I hope we can all have these little grassroots conversations like we're having today to educate people to change the way they talk about things, because that's really how stereotypes begin. It's how we identify things. It's how we talk to one another about them. So
Yeah.
that's a big one.
Yeah, for sure. And the alternatives then for saying committed suicide,
So
death by suicide, or
you can say, I mean, don't be afraid of the
take.
word. People should not
Yeah.
be afraid of the word suicide. When I'm talking about it, I'm really isolating the word committed. That's the one we want to kind of cut off and keep away from suicide. You would say died by suicide. A lot of people now, it's becoming much more mainstream to say suicided. I don't personally use that
Okay.
as often, but I've been hearing it an awful lot lately. I know if you go
Mm.
on TikTok, the only thing you can say is unalived, which I actually hate the fact that TikTok does this, because we should be using the word in the same way that we use the word cancer or we use, the word heart attack. You could say lost their fight to suicide. You could say died by suicide. There are a number of different ways that you can say it in a way that helps preserve that person's dignity a little bit.
So we've sort of spoken about a lot of sort of things around suicide and mental health. So for anyone listening who maybe knows someone who they think might be struggling, they might just notice that something's a little bit off and they want to go and start that conversation with someone. Obviously, it can be a massive thing to do, but how could they potentially start to approach that conversation, having a conversation like that?
I'm really, really glad that we're having this conversation because this is something that, in terms of a takeaway for someone hearing our conversation, it's so powerful because whether or not you or anyone listening has been affected in some way by suicide, if you haven't been, you will be. It's inevitable. And if you don't know someone who's struggling, you will eventually.
Mm,
The most important thing, there are two parts, two answers to this question. The first one is to understand that it's not as complicated as we make it out to be. It's really, again, like we talked about earlier, a matter of holding space and identifying yourself as a safe space. You need to be direct. If you think that someone you care about or someone you work with or someone in your orbit anywhere is not well, the most effective way to ask them is just to ask them really directly. And I know that that really concerns a lot of people because I know people, when they hear how I suggest that you ask them, they get nervous. Like, I don't want to be the reason why someone goes ahead and ends their life. What
mm,
you need to say to someone is, I'm concerned about you. I care about you. Are you thinking of killing yourself? And or are you thinking of harming yourself? And that's the scary part. People freak out because they think, "Oh, I can't say that to someone because then that's going to make them want to go and do that thing."
yeah.
It has been proven time and time and time again that by asking with that kind of direct language, what it does is identify you as a safe person. It says, you're validating me. It says, you hear what I'm saying and you hear that things are not good and you're
Mm,
there for me. You're safe. So, right then and there, it's going to create a bridge of communication between you and that person. And hopefully that person will open up. Well, then the second part is, well, okay, well, what do I do now? Like, it's terrifying to ask the question. And it's even more terrifying worrying that the answer will be yes, because now what the
yeah.
hell do I do? Here in the United States, and I know elsewhere in the world, in almost every country on the planet, they all have their version of a crisis and suicide lifeline. Here in the United States, it's 988. I can't recall what it is in the UK, but I know that there is a similar number to call if you're in crisis. That number is the most valuable tool you have in your pocket as someone trying to help someone. That and your ability to hold space for them. So if you have that initial conversation and you ask that initial hard question, are you thinking of harming or killing yourself? And they say, well, I'm not thinking about it right now, but I've been a little down, I've been depressed, or maybe they say, I have been thinking about it and I'm planning on doing it. The next thing that you're going to say is, would you be willing to call the crisis hotline number and talk to someone? And you
Mm,
also, at the same time, maybe want to ask them, if you don't already know, do you have a therapist? Are you working with a therapist? So if you think that person's at imminent risk, you can actually call that number on their behalf. And it's a third party call. And you say, hey, I'm with my friend. My friend is not okay right now. And maybe they'll tell you how to navigate it, or maybe you'll ask your friend, do you want to talk to them on the line, on the suicide hotline?
yeah.
So it's really encouraging that connection, and it's being very open and transparent in the way that you ask your person if they're okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Really good pointers there, broken down nicely. And it's important to put the numbers out as well. So anyone listening in the UK, the number would be 116123, just so that's in your head as well. Um, and that using the word suicide and sort of being forward with that question of, have you been thinking this way or are you thinking that way? On the flip side, it also, if they do say no and in that case, they might be a little bit shocked that you'd even consider that. But again, at least you've ruled that out in your mind and their mind, and you can move forward because they could still be struggling, but not suicidal as well.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. And look, you can, if it's someone you know well, chances are high that you can have an intimate conversation, you can have an honest conversation. You look, you have to take people at face value. The issue, and I use my own father as an example, the issue with the people who are the extroverts, who are the ones masking, who are the ones who always have a smile on their face and they have a great attitude, but they're struggling beneath the surface. The hard thing is that you can't fix something you don't know is broken. So there is obviously onus on all of us to take care of one another. That's why I always believe we always kind of have to be paying attention to our
Mm.
people and them to us. It's just the way the world should work. But at the same time, you know, it is the responsibility of the person you're asking to be honest. Like they do really, if someone asks you, if you're listening to our conversation, if you're listening to Sam and I talk right now, and you're not okay, and you think that, you need help, and someone close to you calls you out and asks you, be honest with them. Be honest with them because you're not going to get the help that you need unless you are.
Mm.
And, I mean, at the end of the day, unfortunately, there will be people who will be successful in taking their lives for whatever reason because nothing is going to help them. Unfortunately, we can't solve everyone's problems, but we do the very best that we can to be alert and to be paying attention and to know what tools we have available and we use them.
Yeah.
And hopefully the numbers continue to go down instead of up.
Yeah, 100%. So tell me a bit about your the thing you founded. So the Help Hub, is
Hmm.
that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So tell me about that and what it is and how it came about.
Yeah, so the Help Hub is a free, it's a lot of different things. It's a free information site. It's a mental health resources portal that also has curated tools. I have a ton of tools in kind of a virtual toolkit that can help people have hard conversations, exactly like the hard conversation you and I were just talking about, with actual talking points of say this, say this, say this, or let's say someone's grieving. There's a whole info sheet what to say when someone's grieving, because that's awkward, or
Yeah.
what not to say. Or let's say you're feeling dysregulated and you don't know what to do. Maybe you've never felt that way before. I have tools that will help you learn how to do grounding exercises to kind of re-regulate yourself. So there's tools, there's content. You and I were talking offline about the new podcast that I started earlier this spring called The Survivors, where I talk with another woman. She's amazing. She is an attempt survivor. I'm a three-time survivor of suicide loss. So we talk about suicide from two very different perspectives. That funnels into the Help Hub. We have a YouTube channel. I have a ton of content out in the world that focuses on mental health and wellness. And the Help Hub is really just a clearinghouse for people to find crisis resources and support. You can find mindfulness resources. You can find all sorts of inclusive resources. And what sets it apart from most other mental health resource platforms is its inclusive nature. So, you know how when you go onto a major mental health website, maybe they have a nice resource page on their site that has some of the bigger other, the other organizations to
Yeah.
find help. A lot of them are very they're very generic in the sense that they could apply to anyone. There's nothing unique about them in the sense that they don't cater to anyone's unique needs or any particular community or demographic. I felt like there wasn't really a place out in the world for people to go, kind of a one-stop shop for people to go where they could find help. Maybe they're part of the BIPOC community or the Latinx community or the LGBTQ community, or they're a veteran or the elderly. There are so many different communities out there, and based on what kind of community you come from, you have unique needs. Maybe the
Mm.
way that you need to grieve is something different than someone in another community. And I felt like with all the experience that I've had on Crisis Lifelines, there wasn't any one place where everybody could go and then kind of click on the community that represented them to find the unique resources they need. And so that's what the Help Hub is. That's what I didn't find it out in the world, so I built it.
Made it yourself.
And yeah. And
Yeah.
it's been evolving over the past year. I have some incredible partnerships that have developed. And everything, again, I say is free. All the resources are free. All the links to all the support resources and content, everything is free because I don't want there to be any barriers to someone getting the help that they need.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest driver for the whole platform is, I thought of my dad. When you're in that state of chaos in your brain and you're struggling and you're depressed, the last thing in the world you have the capacity to do is go search out what the best resource for you would be. So this platform, the Help Hub, is a place where help is really only a click away. You can just literally look at whatever community you're a part of and say, okay, I'm in the BIPOC community, click, I need suicide and crisis support, click, and you're
Mm.
a click or two away
Takes,
from help. Yeah.
yeah, sounds really good. Sounds very useful for anyone in those scenarios who need, like you say, to get information quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to ask you about sort of any tools or practices that you use yourself or that you'd recommend, and we sort of touched on journaling, maybe therapy as well. But are there any other things that you do to sort of maybe you use during your periods of grief or just to maintain your mental health now?
Yeah, I mean, the ones you just mentioned are definitely big ones for me. I've had a meditation practice now for many, many, many years. That's a very big part of my daily practice. That's how I start every
Mm,
day, just to kind of get centered and set an intention for the day. Movement
yeah,
for me is huge. I either run or practice yoga or weightlift or paddleboard, whatever I can do to move my body every day is just something that I've found for me is just a great outlet. It's incredibly cathartic. It's, good endorphins and all that.
mm,
And honestly, the other thing that a lot of people don't necessarily offer up as a tool, but for me, it's become an invaluable tool, boundaries. Creating boundaries is something that I never did in my life.
right.
And I really started a few years ago to really feel the impact of that. Because when you're always saying yes to everyone and you're always saying yes to everything, little by little, whatever you may need or whatever you may want just kind of starts to fade away. And all you're doing is, being a yes man to everybody else. And you're absolutely ignoring everything that you need. And so I personally have done a lot of work building up that practice for myself. And
Yeah.
now it's become kind of a non negotiable thing. It doesn't mean I care any less. It doesn't mean I show up any less. It just means that I prioritize myself and what I need first because I'm no good to my own kids, my husband, my family, my friends if I'm not okay in here.
Mm.
So that's a big one for me. So it's kind of like a combination of all those things.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, you mentioned a lot that maybe people would sort of know, and hearing meditation is sort of one that people talk about
Hmm.
as well. But boundaries to be put in there is quite an interesting one. But I totally see why. And I had a conversation only an episode or two ago about how to set boundaries as part of it and how they're commonly we use boundaries as a form of control on others rather than actually our own boundaries.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, definitely, I can see how that would be beneficial to your mental health as well.
Yeah, it's for me, it's been game changing.
When we look at the statistics around suicide, in the UK, about 75% of suicides are men. In the US, I think it raises to nearly 80%, just
Mm-hmm.
having a look at some statistics.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we're hearing lots more, and like you said, how it's changed over the years about how we speak about the topics, and sort of saying men need to speak more and try and get men speaking more. How do we actually make this happen? Do we need to approach it differently between men and women?
Yeah, I actually was on a podcast a couple of days ago. The host was a man who was talking quite a bit about men's mental health and how to create that same that same sense of permission with men.
Mm,
Yeah, I don't know if there's any one way, honestly, Sam, to get people, to get men in particular, to be more open and honest. I think that it probably has to be at a local level, a grassroots level, a community level where
yeah,
people barbershop conversations. And I mean, it may sound silly, but it's that's the kind of place where that sort of thing starts, where people within small groups are showing their vulnerability or being vulnerable. I know that I partner with an organization here in the United States called Therapy for Black Men. And that whole barbershop conversation concept came up many times where it really sometimes is as simple as being in those typical environments where, like on the basketball court, at the pickup
yeah,
game, where guys are so trained to be the alpha male and so trained to not show weakness and vulnerability. And all of a sudden, they're starting to flip that script at that community level, having meetups where guys are just encouraged to come in the door, sit down, and just let it out, where they're encouraged to cry, where they may have grown up in a home where they were taught the opposite. Don't cry. You're a weak little girl if you're crying. We need to change that within our own little unique communities. And then there's
mm,
this ripple effect. It permeates outside of that little
yeah,
community level. And I think there's no one great way to do it. I just think that lots of little conversations, and look, you're a guy on your podcast talking about how do we make guys more vulnerable. That's one of the main things that we can do, is just to have these conversations about how okay it really is for men and boys to show that human side and to show that they're afraid or that they're imperfect, because there's so much pressure put on you guys to be, to be infallible and be rock solid and don't show you're afraid or sad, and it needs to change.
yeah. Yeah, I think you're totally right. It comes from that grassroots level of hearing other people in your community, people you hang out with, talking about their own issues. And I've seen it before. I've seen people speak out about something they went through, and then suddenly five other guys have put their hands up and gone, actually, I've been through something very similar. And I suppose it's that, just getting the ball rolling from the bottom up, probably, rather than the other way around.
Hmm.
I wasn't laughing because it sounded silly, actually. It's because I've had a guy on who's actually started that as a thing, going, he's a barber, and he's starting this movement of trying to get barbershops in on it as a safe place to sort of have some of these conversations and getting people trained up. So yeah, that's why I laughed, because I thought it was good that you mentioned that.
I love that. I love that. Have you ever, speaking of that, have you ever heard, he's an influencer, he's pretty popular. His name is Vic Blend. Have you ever heard of
No,
him?
I haven't. No.
Look him up. He is a young guy. I think he's 27 or 28 years old. And he goes around in the community, in his, all over the world now at this point, because he's wildly popular now. And he carries around his shears and his comb and a little folding chair. And he'll be out on the sidewalk or at the park or at the basketball game. And he'll encourage people to come over. Could be a child, could be an older man. And it's not just men, it's women too, but predominantly men. And he'll offer them a free haircut if they sit down and, what are your hopes? What are your dreams? What scares you? Let's have an open, vulnerable conversation. He just had a conversation with President Obama,
Oh wow.
and like cut President Obama's hair and Tom Brady's hair. And of course, those are the celebrities that he can now reach. But in the beginning, he just started, like on the subway platform. Come and tell
Mm,
me what's going on. What are you most afraid of? What do you want to do with your life? And that's how people That's how people change. That's how
Yeah.
cultures change.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the other aspect of it as well is that it's not a direct eye to eye conversation. I think that's something that especially men struggle with, but some women will as well,
Hmm.
is that sit down opposite me, look into my eyes and tell me exactly what you're feeling. It's like, whoa. So like going out on, that's why sort of running next to someone, walking, driving, and getting a haircut is the sort of perfect times to sort of open up and talk, because you're not, you might feel like as you say something you're going to get a bad response, so you almost don't want to see it.
Yeah, yeah. I actually took that same philosophy and I started a group here. I wanted to do something on a local grassroots level that kind of married movement and mental health and being vulnerable, and I settled on a walking group, a different type of a walking group, because that's really something that almost anyone can participate in. If you're a runner and it's a running group, well, then if you're not a runner, you're excluded.
Yeah.
Or, you know what I mean? So I wanted to make the playing field as level as I could. And I'm partnering with a lot of the YMCAs here in the Boston area. And the group is called the Walk Talk Collective. And we just meet on Monday mornings. We met today at 6:30 a.m. And any age, any ability level, people just come out with the understanding that we're not only moving our bodies, but we're having open, honest, vulnerable conversations about basically it's the shit that goes on in your heads. You
Mm.
know what I mean? And the things that if you're a parent that we all struggle with our kids, or if you're a spouse, things that might challenge us in a relationship or at work, how it's so hard to maintain work-life balance. All of these things, we're doing it in a way that everybody's out and we're moving, but we have an automatic safe space. And some of the conversations, Sam, have been absolutely mind blowing because they've been so raw, and all it takes is that one person to say, "Ugh, my teenage daughter is driving me insane. I just want to rip her head off." And then all of a sudden, you have eight more people who are like, "Oh my God, my teenage son or my teenage,"
Yeah.
and it's just this beautiful ripple effect. And whether it's barbershops or walks or anything like that, like the more we do this with each other, that's the bottom line. That's how you affect change.
Mm. We talk about a mental health crisis. It's a word or a phrase that people use a lot. Do you think the number of people that are struggling has actually increased over the years, or do you think it's more that as we become more aware of it, more things are diagnosed, it just seems that way?
Yes, and yes. I think it's a combination. I mean, honestly, fairly, I think it's a combination of both. I
Yeah.
think that, look, when I was a child, I remember back to being at the lunch table at school. Not a single child had a peanut allergy. Every single child was eating a peanut butter sandwich with no crust. And
Yeah.
now all of a sudden, we're living in a culture where we can't even open a bag of peanuts on an airplane.
Yeah.
And I think that problems definitely existed back then, but I think that there are different factors nowadays that have fleshed them out into the open. Like, yes, we're talking about things more often, which is definitely the right direction. But it also means that we're classifying and identifying and highlighting and paying attention to more things. So it's
Mm.
kind of a double-edged situation. Um, I mean, I want to say I think that things are definitely moving in the right direction. I think the bottom line is that no one ever realized that people have as much crap on their minds and in their hearts and that they struggle with as they do. I think that's
Yeah.
it. I think it's because we've all been taught to bury these issues and these fears and these illnesses that people didn't talk about them, and now people are talking about them. So it seems like there's this massive floodgate that's opened up, but in reality
Yeah.
it's always been there, and now we're just talking about it.
Mm. I suppose you've always had the sort of day to day issues and problems that you come across as a human being, um, issues or maybe in relationships with family, friends, neighbors. Um, you would have had the news, obviously, so you'd have had updates about maybe what's going on around the country and or the world. But obviously nowadays we're just fed almost minute by minute updates of exactly what's happening all over the world. So the amount of people who then take those on as extra stress and extra, I feel so strongly about this that I'm going to let it affect me on top of everything else that you've got going on as just your human day to day life. I think I can see why people are more sort of stressed in these days as well because of that reason.
Well, yeah, I mean, how can we not be? Because now we're being drawn into all of these global issues. We're seeing all of these traumatizing and in some cases horrific images, and we can't look away because if you turn the television off, it's on the radio. And if you turn the radio off and
Mm,
you go to your phone, it's now in the palm of your hand. So, and then everyone's talking about it and everyone's amplifying it
yeah,
and everyone has an opinion about it. And it's really impossible in the world that we all live in. I don't care where we live. I'm sure it's just as bad for you in the UK as it is for me here in the United States and elsewhere in the world that we at this point in history are so overloaded by it that we cannot get away from it. And that's that inherited trauma or that's that acquired trauma. I lived on the opposite coast from where all of the massive fires in Los Angeles were earlier this year. It was absolutely devastating to know that this other area of the country was being so profoundly impacted that there was no way to not be affected by it or what's going on in the Middle East or or what's going on in other parts of the world. The conflict comes to us now.
yeah,
It's now kind of infused into us whether we want it to be or not.
yeah. You spoke about thought that it was going in the right direction, sort of the conversation around this area. How do you see the conversation around mental health and suicide changing in maybe the next 10 years from now?
Well, I hope number one that more people are getting the help that they need because more people are being open and honest about what's really going on behind the curtain, which I think is the biggest thing. I hope that suicide rates drop dramatically because of that. See, it's the conversation and the vulnerability and the openness that will cause that ripple effect, that positive ripple effect, which means people will get the help that they need. And
Mm,
I ultimately hope that we eventually live in a world where saying you're not okay doesn't stand out anymore. Saying that you have mental illness doesn't cause people to pause anymore. Or
yeah.
saying that you've thought of suicide or you know someone who's contemplated or achieved followed through with a suicide. I hope that we end up living in a world where it becomes a normal part of the conversation to talk about these things so that stigmas don't exist anymore and people don't feel like they have to be silent.
Mm,
That's my hope. I mean, I see things going in that direction. I think the fact that just you and I can sit here and have this conversation openly and that people will hear it and people will receive it, I think that's how we do it. And I think the more of us who are collectively having this kind of a conversation globally, that's how we do it. So I
yeah,
think we can get there. I really do.
yeah, I agree. Bringing it into a close, then, one of the things I like to do at the end of an episode is leave a question for the listener or get you to leave a question for the listener. So someone who's listened to this whole episode or maybe wants to go away and have a conversation around the topic, what question would you leave them to go and start that conversation?
I think I would ask them to ask themselves, how can I be more vulnerable in the way that I communicate with the people closest to me? What can I do as a person who is in control of what I share? How can I be more transparent and more open? That's one question. And then I think I would also say, how how can I look after the people around me who I care the most about better? How
Mm,
can I ask more pointed questions, more open-ended questions. How can I check in a little bit more often, a little bit deeper with those people so I don't miss anything?
Mm. I love that you started with looking internally first.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's so important because
Well, we have to.
we often might say, go up to someone and ask them how they're doing. Well, actually, how are you doing first? Because if you're not doing okay, maybe you're not best placed to go and have that conversation.
Exactly.
Um, Lisa, it's been brilliant having you on. Thank you so much for coming on. If people want to find out a bit more about yourself, follow what you're doing online, where can they find you?
They can go to thehelphub.co and bookmark the site, share it. Please, please share it with anyone you know who might need some extra resources. All of my content is there. All my socials are there. You can get in touch with me there. It's the best place to go, just thehelphub.co.
Awesome. I'll link it below so anyone listening can just scroll down and click on it. To the listener, if you have enjoyed this episode, please do share it with someone who you think will find some value from it. If you haven't already, please do follow the podcast and rate the show wherever you're listening. It really helps us reach new people and get new listeners in on the conversation. And if you would like to follow on Instagram, see behind the scenes and keep up to date at Lonely Chapter Podcast. And lastly, from me, thank you for listening and stay curious.